I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for allowing us time to talk about an ongoing research programme that looks at the psychology of mental mediumship from the perspectives of both the medium and the sitter. We're grateful to our funders for their kind support. That includes the Society for Psychical Research's Survival Committee and also a Swiss charity that wishes to remain anonymous. Without their support, this project would not have been possible. This will be a joint presentation by three of the co-authors. I'll take about 10 minutes to give you some background context for the programme of work. I'll then pass on to Ewan McLean and then on to Phil Kinnersley, who will each describe the project that they're responsible for. Ewan and Phil are postgraduate research students at the University of Northampton who've been working with us since October 2019, and so are approaching the halfway point of their PhDs. The co-authors are all members of the EECS research group at the University of Northampton. EECS stands for Exceptional Experiences and Consciousness Studies, and the team here has a range of interests that extends from transpersonal psychology through parapsychology and on to more traditional consciousness research approaches. EECS is a relatively large group, currently comprising 8 postdoctoral members of academic staff, 7 PhD students, and 3 research assistants. The EECS group sits within the Centre for Psychology and Social Sciences, and the Centre's mission is to conduct research that can have real impact on people's mental health and psychological well-being. And so the work of EECS is aligned to that, particularly to contribute to and promote the evidence base that normalizes so-called paranormal experience. That involves experimental work to test the ontological claims for parapsychological phenomena. And so, for example, elsewhere on the program this year, I talk about the Ganzfeld research that we've been conducting over the last 20 years or so. But it also involves other forms of research that explore the effects of paranormal experiences so as to optimize the outcome for the experiencer, what would in recent times be called clinical parapsychology. It follows from this agenda that one of our priorities is to ground the research we do in lived experience. So this reflects a concern we have that although there's a great value in designing sophisticated experiments through which to interrogate psi, these naturally take us further away from the experience as it occurs in situ and away from the person having the experience. We want to ensure that even the experimental work we do is informed by a fine-grained understanding of the phenomena as they naturally occur, so that we can ensure that our designs are fit for purpose. In conventional terms, they have high ecological validity. Equally, this should mean that any discoveries we make in that experimental work should readily translate back into something that we can communicate to experiences in a way that has meaning for them. If it's not too presumptuous, I would liken this to Louisa Rhine's case collection work, where her analysis of the very spontaneous cases that were sent to her were used to inform the kind of experimental work that JB and the team might have conducted at the Rhine Centre. And in this way, we have this progressive circular loop where experimental evidence informs our understanding of real world phenomena, and our appreciation of it feeds back into more refined and tailored research designs, experimental designs. A bit quicker that time moving through. So a natural starting point is to ask the general public about the kinds of beliefs that they have about parapsychological phenomena and to explore the experiences that may be the impetus for them. In this session, we want to focus particularly on claims for survival of personality after bodily death, since these beliefs and experiences are relatively common. To that end, in March 2019, I commissioned an online survey with the market research company YouGov. They're perhaps best known for political surveys and for testing popular opinion regarding current affairs, but they are organized in such a way that they represent a very cost-effective way of accessing large representative samples. In this case, 2019 adults from their user panel completed the survey. The data have been weighted based on the personality characteristics of the individuals so as to generalize to the population as a whole in the UK. YouGov, in this case, presume a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. At the time of the survey, the Office for National Statistics in the UK estimated that there were 52.4 adults residents in the United Kingdom. So we can estimate then, based on these data, that somewhere in the region of 26.4 million people in the UK believe that near-death experiences are real. We can also estimate that 17.8 million people believe that ghosts and spirits of the dead may be able to come back under certain circumstances. 21.4 million people that unusual phenomena can occur around the time of death. 14.6 million that spontaneous post-mortem communications are possible. And although the figures are reducing, there are still 9.4 million people who believe that mediums have a genuine ability to communicate with the dead. In comparison, just 17.4 million people voted for Britain to leave the European Union. And that's had substantial and overwhelming kind of consequences for the politics and the social setting in the UK at the moment. So in that context, some of these figures are extremely large. Now, in that survey, I also asked people about their personal experiences to the extent that they might underpin their levels of belief. Focusing again on survival phenomena, we find that rather than being a marginal practice that affects very few people, this survey suggests that approximately 4.9 million UK adults have personally visited a medium for a reading. And of those, 3.9 million found the reading to be accurate, and just slightly fewer, at 3.7 million, found the reading to be helpful. This isn't quite the picture that we see from skeptical accounts of the medium client dyad. This, in our view, represents a strong prima facie case for finding out more about what the experience entails and why it might be regarded as impressive or evidential, as we've seen from the belief scores. And so that gives us the impetus for the kind of work that we've been doing for some time now in the United Kingdom. We have a long history of interest in mediumship. My own PhD at the Kersler unit in the 1990s was concerned with mapping cold reading strategies and included work with a successful pseudopsychic who allowed us to video his modus operandi and his analysis of the readings as we reviewed the footage together. These are techniques that allow the practitioner to present information about the client as if from a discarnate source, but they're actually derived from basic psychological principles, such as the Barnum effect, and the exploitation of non-verbal cues and verbal feedback so as to tailor a reading to fit the client. What's especially important is the quality of the information that you can provide for the client depends on the circumstances of the interaction. So under different settings, under different circumstances, we might expect very different kinds of information if the practitioner is only using cold reading. This has led to a pyramid model that Liz Roxburgh and I revisited more recently in edited books by Christopher Moorman and Adam Rock. And there are pictures of those at the top if you don't have them and are interested. Now, when Liz joined me in 2006 to study for a PhD on mediumship, we began a relationship with the Spiritualist National Union. And this is their headquarters here in the middle on the slide. The first phase of that collaboration focused on mediums' mental health and the practices that mediums used in order to manage their experiences in a way that meant that they were less distressing than they seemed to be for lay people. More recently, with Rachel Evenden and David Saunders, the people pictured at the bottom here, we've been using our connections with the SNU for outreach purposes, introducing practitioners to the principles of the scientific method in such a way that they can critically reflect on their own experience, but also that they can robustly respond to the kinds of claims that they are confronted with from relatively uninformed skeptics about the quality of the evidence and the nature of the testing. More recently, this has culminated in an EEG experiment that's intended to replicate earlier work by Arnaud Delorme and his team at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. But of course, this has sadly been suspended for the last 18 months or so because of lockdown. And unfortunately, the COVID pandemic means that it's unlikely that we can restart that project until probably the new year, next year, 2022. Fortunately, the project we want to talk about today has not been impacted in quite the same way by COVID. So I can tell you a little bit about the focus here before I introduce the first of our other speakers. Here, we're particularly interested in the psychology of the mediumistic sitting dyad, and we want to look at it from those two perspectives that emphasize the nature of that dyad. So for clients, what causes people to become a repeat client? What is it about their expectations in attending the sitting? What is it about their perceptions of the interaction and their reflections on them that leads them to think of this as a reliable source of connection with their deceased loved ones that they want to pursue further? And equally, what causes somebody to identify as a medium? What is it about those experiences that suggests to them a particular kind of sensitivity that might be cultivated and might have benefit for society? So without stealing the thunder of my two colleagues, it's now time to pass you over to Ewan McLean, who's going to tell you more about the first aspect of that, which is the role of the client. Ewan.
Thank you, Chris. As Chris mentioned there, the focus of my research is more on the client's perspective. There's tendency within mediumship research to focus on the medium, but my research is focusing on the client in the mediumship dyad. Firstly, the project I'm working on now is conducted in 3 phases. The first phase of this will be a survey, and it will be followed up with 2 qualitatives following explanatory sequence design. I want to talk today mainly about the survey results, which I've already gathered from the research I've done up to this point. If you look at previous research, there's a tendency, as Chris was saying there, to be proof orientated when it comes to mediumship. And this is about counting the amount of hits and the success rates of particular types of mediums. But from the client's perspective, something quite trivial, and I'll give examples of this later from my own research, can often be very strong evidence of survival for them. Other work is generally looked at in relation to bereavement and bereavement process. Beischel talks about the client mediumship relationship being a form of self-prescribed treatment for grief in that way. There's also a certain amount of stigma associated with going along to assisted after-death communication, examples, mediumship being the primary way that is conducted. And when it comes to bereavement processes, the studies that have been carried out that have looked at the bereavement and grief associated with it, if people have used mediums and found them to be genuine, or from their perspective genuine, they'll often find that the ideas to do with hope and resilience and post-traumatic growth are clear things that come out of the experience that once they've been through a mediumship reading. This is very much in line with continuing bond models, for instance, like Class, who popularized this idea, where in traditional models of grief, people are basically told to get over their loved one. But in a continuing bond models, it's not about severing it. It's about having that continued relationship with somebody in the post-mortem state. So particularly in the works of, for instance, Walters, he looks at this, and there's a nice quote here to sort of illustrate this point. By focusing on the dead rather than on the bereaved, mediums may offer something to mourners denied to them by those bereavement counsellors who focus on the client's feelings. Mourners typically think about the dead as much as their own feelings, and is this what the medium recognises and caters for? And that's a clear thing that it would apply to a continuing bonds model. We also have worked from mediums' own interpretations of the client's experiences, and this tends to see themselves again in that role as in relation to grief and the relief that the client gets from particular types of reading. On the more quantitative side, there's been surveys carried out, and particularly this is often to do with measurements of belief. Looking at belief scales, and often included questions about this, which can tell us about demographics, for instance. It's more gendered, these types of things, but they don't really focus on the client's experiences. Exceptions for that are Chris's own work from 1998, where he looked at specifically to do with the more broad category of mediumship and psychics. And what he found from that research there, using a sample in Edinburgh, that people generally found that the readings quite accurate. About 50% were saying it was accurate to them, and it was also helpful to them. And this is something that I've followed up in my own research here. Can you go to the next slide, Chris, please? So there's been a lack of a detailed systematic study of those that use the service of mediums, with tendency to be quite small scale and focus on bereavement processes. The larger scale quantitative methods that have explored these things tell us about frequencies, but don't really tell us much about the client's own interpretation of the mediumship client dyad. Exceptions such as Rowe haven't really been followed up, and Rowe's study was limited to the Edinburgh area. And again, this is something I want to take further. So we're left with making assumptions about the client's needs and expectations, and why they attended demonstrations in the first place, and how they interpreted that experience. The next slide, please. So my project, as I said, using explanatory sequence design, I wanted to capture a survey to start with, to capture the UK population, and then this is going to feed into my later work, and I'll talk about that as I go through. The key aims I'm trying to find out is, well, what's the UK engagement with mediumship? How do clients formulate an opinion on the veracity of these claims? What are the needs and expectations? And what are these needs and expectations met when they visit a medium? This got ethical approval from Northampton University, with some concerns obviously about, we're looking at ideas to do with bereavement and grief here. But because we're taking an ontologically neutral stance here, there's no direct questions that should challenge people's beliefs in there. And also, all data was anonymized and conformed to BPS standards for ethical concerns. In the next slide, please, Chris. This was funded, as Chris mentioned before, rather than doing a localized sample that Chris had done previously in his research. I got generous funding from the Society for Psychical Research Survival Fund that allowed me to, again, employ YouGov. We've used YouGov in a number of our research projects now and found them to be very conducive to this type of research. So my sample was of 2,072, again, weighted for the adult population to be representative of the adult population. And this was conducted in November of last year. Next slide, please. So initially I asked about life after death, but in the interest of time, let's get into the mediumship ideas. And this is similar results to Chris's work. And again, Chris's work going previously back to there. And if you look at other research in this area that's measuring paranormal belief, generally you're finding about a fifth to a quarter of the population agreeing with statements. This is using a Likert scale, so strongly agree or agree. The net agree is about 19%. And we've got 14% sitting on the fence there. Next slide, please. Next, I asked, it's fair enough you believe in particular types of mediumship or being a genuine type of paranormal event, but have you actually been along to a mediumship demonstration? So again, all 78% of the population haven't been. What we're seeing here is about almost a quarter have engaged or attended some form of mediumship demonstration in their lives. Again, this is similar to Chris's own research, his previous research. Next slide, please. So from that, I wanted to find out, well, where did you attend a mediumship demonstration? There's multiple ways clients can engage with mediumship. A quick Google search will instantly show you there's many ways you can interact with them. For the more sort of orthodox methods, for the Spiritualist National Union, where you go along to a demonstration, to private readings, to basically party events in some ways where you can book a medium. And as you can see from this research here, from this results here, that a private reading, the personal type of reading, is by far the most common way people are interacting with that. Although the social aspects, again, are shown strongly in here. Can you get the next slide, please, Chris? What I wanted then to find out then is what was your initial reasons for coming along to the a mediumship demonstration? So you see along the bottom here, first one is comfort and reassurance at number 1. The second was to seek advice. The third was to test the claims of mediumship itself, to go along to test the claim. Fourth was curiosity. Fifth was entertainment. The sixth is to confirm your belief in life after death, because that's another area that people may want to go along for. And number 7 was to contact a specific person, to try and contact a specific person. If you selected other, it opened up a dialogue box, and you could put in a reason. You could type in a reason yourself there. And in that part, the main reason people cited was they were going along to support somebody else, so somebody else that wanted to go along to a mediumship reading, or their friend had organised it. So that was the primary reason. I contrary to the idea that this is purely about bereavement. Oh, it jumped. Oh, that's all right, Chris. That's fine. The curiosity appears to be the major factor. And again, if you're going back to Chris's 1998 study, where entertainment was a primary factor here, and curiosity again, this is not entirely surprising. It was kind of surprising to me because we were concentrating just on mediumship. Chris's previous research had looked more at the broader spectrum of psychics and mediumship in there. But have you, just because you've been a long-term medium, it doesn't mean, say, you've personally had a message in attendance. So, you know, I've been along to a spiritualist church before. You don't always get a reading specific to you. So the next question addressed that. I wanted to find out if people had actually attended, had actually received a message that they thought was from the spirit world in that sense. And it got a nice split here, 50-50, I suppose. 14% are sitting on the fence, but 36% are just saying definitively that they think they have received a message from the spirit world. So next, next slide, Chris, please. The next part was I wanted to find out about the messages that are received in there. Now, I wanted to measure it in 4 different things, on accuracy, the specificity of the message, the meaningfulness of the message, and how helpful they found that message as well. Just because something is accurate, it doesn't mean to say it's specific. So, for instance, if we're looking at stock Barnum sort of statements, you're an independent thinker who takes pride in doing things differently than others, well, that would be accurate for me. However, it's quite obvious that that's not very specific to me in that sense. So if we look at something else, for instance, like if we look at Blackmore's work, when she's done a sample for the UK population, and she used statements like, you have a scar on your left knee, 36% of the population said yes. Now, again, using this criteria, that would be an accurate statement for at least 36% of people. It'd be quite specific, but it wouldn't really be meaningful to them in that sense. It's not a very meaningful statement in there. And it certainly wouldn't be a helpful statement in that sense. So as Chris was alluding to there, the sort of more stock spiels, the more Barnum sort of type effects, the cold reading type of effects, I was hoping to capture something a bit more by giving these different criterias in here. And surprisingly, as hopefully you'll see in the next slide, I got very surprising results in the how accurately, specifically, and meaningful and helpful people were rating this. So when it comes to accuracy, 92% were saying, and again, I've not seen anything this high before. The only thing I think comparable was Haraldson's earlier work, which was looking at seances. And people, I think it was 82% that he said that they'd found the experience useful for them, however we define useful. But this was exceedingly high, right? So 92% overall net were thinking this was accurate. They were saying it was specific and meaningful and helpful to them when it comes to these types of statements, which kind of alludes to something more complex going on here than that standard stock spiels that people often attribute, or the more mundane explanations people attribute to how mediums carry out this from a non-paranormal cognition method. Can I get the next slide, please, Chris? Next, and the last 2 questions addressed in the survey, I managed to get in a nice qualitative element, which I asked them about the impressiveness of the communication and why they found it impressive in there. Now, generally, as probably it wasn't entirely surprising, when it came to the people filling that in, a lot of them were quite short responses. The details, for instance, that was a quite common one, but you know, they found it impressive. But there was some extended responses which I wanted to look at thematically. So it was about 130 responses in there. This word cloud illustrates the kind of key communications that were in there. So personal, communicate, describe, identify, these types of things were common things that came up. So I identified 3 themes that are on the next slide. I just want to give you some illustrations of some of the things there. So I was asking about the impressive nature of the communication itself and what they found impressive in there. And the key thing that came up was that personal nature of the communications and the specificity of the communications. And I'll give you a flavour of some of the things there. So objects were quite common. Again, if you look at mediumship literature, this is something that's described, but some quite unusual examples. And going back to that, what I was originally saying about the mundane and being very impressive to them, here's an example from one of the people that done the survey. A medium told me my nan knew the animals on my socks. They were fully covered by my boots at that time. Now, I'm asking about the impressive nature in this, so I don't know what went on that reading, but that quite trivial thing has this major lasting impression on the client's experience. Another one described a photo I had of my father in my pocket. I never took it out of my pocket. These types of things. There were also a number of them identified, again, things like names, often nicknames, which they found particularly impressive when it came to these types of communication, things that you're not readily guessable in that way. And another great example here about characteristic, where the person wrote, she knew he had 2 different coloured eyes. I mean, that's something very specific in that sense. But also things that were quite mundane again. Told my mum someone was putting up a dado rail, and my uncle was that day. Mum only found out after out this after. So something. This is this is what they're counting as the most impressive. This is something that's had this impression on them. And also some quite spectacular examples. For instance, my uncle had died unknown to me and came through and told me he had died on my birthday a week before. So the person that doesn't even realize this person's dead, and they're suddenly communicating with them through the spirit, from the spirit world in that sense. Next, identified this rationalizing experience. In some of the more sort of skeptical accounts, this is often seen as clients being sort of a dupe, that they're easily being duped. But quite a lot of the more extended responses I heard in there gave examples where they were talking specifically about Barnum, cold reading effects and hot reading effects as well. Not using that terms, but you could see clearly they were trying to rationalize these types of things along similar lines. She didn't fish for information. You know, I have quite a lot of people couch that, and I don't have any information online. I'm not on Facebook. However, they found this out about me. These types of statements. So people are genuinely seem to be aware of these types of things. And another key thing that was identified in there was this idea of continuing bonds and closure. That's a common theme within the literature as well. This was often to do with the idea of the spirit still having some kind of interaction with the person. So my mother-in-law was well described. She told me she was watching out for me. It comforts me to know that death is not the end. Felt cared for and reassured, also inquisitive and puzzled. Personal things and comfort after the loss of someone. These types of things as well. So just moving on to the last slide for my section before I hand over. The key things that I've identified then, there's many people engaging with mediumship in the UK, and curiosity rather than maybe other factors that we maybe think about seems to be a major factor. But after that initial reason, the curiosity, when you actually receive a message, seems to tend to be rated incredibly highly or exceedingly highly in the results I've got here. And people are reflexively trying to rationalize that explanation through for looking for a more mundane explanations. But also, the things that can be quite trivial seem to have a major impact in how they interpret these things. So while in a classic sort of measurement, it would be about the hit, these smaller things, for instance, that lady's socks, has played a major impact on her belief systems there. Moving forward, I'll be moving into a more qualitative element to try and tease out some of these areas that I've identified in the survey. And the survey will help inform as we go through into the next 2 phases, which will be an ethnography of me going along to mediumship demonstrations myself, and also then moving into an interview phase, which will hopefully address some of the questions the many questions that I've got after concluding this survey. And with that, I'll hand over to Phil.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ewan, and thanks to Chris for the introduction. My part of the project focuses on the experiences of developing mental mediumship skills in the current UK spiritualist context. Can you flip the slide, please? Thanks. Now, if we define mediums as people who deliberately communicate with spirits of deceased individuals in order to convey messages from these individuals to people still in physical form, and then spiritualist mediums are those who are accredited in the UK by the Spiritualist National Union, and they subscribe to the 7 principles of spiritualism listed here. The main one for us is the one that involves the continuing existence of the human soul, and also the belief that they can communicate with these souls. Next slide, please. Thanks. While, as both Ewan and Chris have said, a lot of mediumship research has focused on proving that mediums are able to provide accurate, specific information that they couldn't have known by normal means, there's relatively little research on the phenomenology of the mediumship experience. Principal studies in this area come from the work of Roxburgh and Rowe and Gilbert in the UK, and Beischel, Rock and Schwartz and others, and Emmons in the US. From these studies, we can identify 3 key aspects of the mediumship experience. Mediums have a way of knowing when they're connected to the spirit world, as opposed to, say, working psychically, getting information from living individuals. They can control when they communicate with the spirit world and can manage the process of communication, such as requesting specific information or asking for clarification. And they can work in different sensory modalities, including, say, visually through clairvoyance, or aurally through clairaudience, or by inner feeling or inner knowing, clairsentience and claircognizance. Next slide, please. So while some of the studies indicate that many of the participants have had anomalous experience since childhood, not all of the people who had these experiences initially interpreted them as mediumistic communications. So, for example, several of Roxburgh's participants described having anomalous experiences which they couldn't understand, they couldn't control, they found them disturbing and distressing, in some instances questioning their sanity. From this, we can infer that the development of mediumship skills involves learning to interpret anomalous experiences as potential spirit communication, learning to differentiate between spirit communication and other types of anomalous experiences, learning to control the communication process, and learning to use multiple inner senses in the interests of gaining information. Next slide, please. Right, so there is very little research on the phenomenology of the learning processes. While we have information on external aspects, such as descriptions of unfoldment and development circles, which I'll explain later, and we have some descriptions of the experience of the development process from medium autobiographies, such as those of Garrett, Stokes, and O'Brien, pictured here, there isn't much specific research. Roxburgh and Emmons' work includes descriptions of some of their participants' experiences, however, development experiences, that is. However, these were established mediums, so like the autobiographies, the descriptions were retrospective rather than contemporaneous. We do have some contemporaneous information from autoethnographic studies, including those of Emmons, Meintel, Roberts, and Wilson. However, all these were conducted from a sociological viewpoint. So overall, we can see that for all the research done, phenomenology is not the specific focus, so that descriptions of inner experiences of development processes are illustrative rather than systematically investigated. And with the exception of Wilson, the autoethnographies were conducted for research purposes. So the experiences that these people reported may have been different from the experiences of those who are developing mediumship for personal purposes. Next slide, please. So my current research will therefore focus specifically on gathering contemporaneous information on the phenomenology of the development of spiritualist mediums, with the aim of increasing our insight into and our understanding of the experiences and processes involved. The reason for focusing on spiritualist mediumship is that the Spiritualist National Union has a mediumship development process of long standing, which is relatively uniform across the country. Now, the standard method for phenomenological research is that of the semi-structured interview. So I propose to do a longitudinal series of interviews with a small number of mediums in order to gain insight into their experiences of change and progress. To facilitate the interview process, I'll need to work to establish a good rapport with the interviewees, which will allow them, hopefully, to speak freely without the fear of being judged, something particularly important given the negative aspects of some of the skeptical research, which was referred to earlier. I will also need to gain a good understanding of common concepts and terminology, so that I don't have to repeatedly ask for definitions or clarification, which would hamper the flow of communication. This last is made more difficult by the anomalous nature of mediumship experiences, in that it's likely to be difficult to describe the experiences, especially to people who've not had similar ones. And in this case, I don't have any experience of mediumistic communications, as far as I know. So this indicated the need for a preliminary ethnographic study, which would give me the opportunity to learn about the processes at first hand and gain some insider knowledge of the concepts and experiences involved. Next slide, please. Thank you. The ethnographic approach that I used was one of observant participation in which the ethnographer takes on a specific role within the community studied, thus aiming for depth of insight into a particular role or activity as opposed to breadth of knowledge. To explain the process of spiritualist mediumship briefly, development is usually within a spiritualist church. The first stage is usually a weekly unfoldment circle in which the participants practice the process of attuning to the spirit world. And the second stage is usually a weekly development circle in which participants practice the process of communicating with specific spirits in order to relay messages from them to other members of the circle. Due to COVID restrictions, although I wanted to join a local circle, I wasn't able to. However, the SNU has an international branch, the SNUI, which runs online, and I was unable to join one of their online unfoldment circles. Next slide, please, Chris. Okay, so I've been attending the Unfoldment Circle for 11 months and the Development Circle for nearly 4 months now. The project has ethics approval from the University of Northampton, and I joined with the explicit permission of the circle leader on the basis that the object of the study would be my own experiences and the overall processes. So I was not going to be studying the other participants on an individual basis, and I was definitely not going to be collecting any identifiable information from them. The image I have here is generic. It doesn't relate to any of my groups. Also, the fact that I was participating in the same way as the other participants, going through the exercises and being open-minded as to any experiences I might have, also serves to remove any constraints, hopefully, that might have been felt by the other participants if I had simply been observing and not participating. So in the following slides, I'll briefly describe my experiences of the unfoldment and development circles and look at the ways that what I've learned will inform the interview processes. Start with the unfoldment circle. The routine is a 40-minute attunement process. It's a visualization process where we picture ourselves connecting to a source of energy, absorbing the energy, focusing our awareness externally, and meeting our spirit guides. These are generally held to be highly developed spirits whose role is to assist the living in spirit communication, spirit healing, and personal development. This is followed by the visualization of a meeting place, such as a garden bench, where we may meet a discarnate known to us, such as a family member or friend. I have to say, the first time I tried this, the circle leader asked us to envisage a cottage as the meeting place, and I was a bit surprised when the door to my cottage was opened by Shrek, who welcomed me in and made me a cup of tea. Now, I was pretty sure that he wouldn't count as a bona fide discarnate, and I was a bit unsure what to say in the debriefing time afterwards, during which each participant in turn is invited to share their experiences. Decided to be honest, and I was relieved when the circle leader just laughed and said, well, that's a first. So obviously not many people see Dreamsworks characters. She said, don't worry, maybe you'll get something different next time. The main thing is to relax and enjoy it. This was typical of the accepting and unpressurized environment that she established and maintained, and it was very reassuring for me. And luckily, yes, I did move on from Shrek. The unfoldment circle introduced me to some key terms and concepts and the ways that these are used in the context of spiritualist mediumship development. So the concepts of energy and vibration, these are terms that are common from the literature on spiritual or energy healing. In this context, they weren't defined. We were told that we had to raise our vibrations as the spirit world operates at a higher vibrational level. They would then lower their vibrations until the two sets of vibrations were in tune, at which point we could communicate. And this was seen to be done by what they term sitting in the power, where we imagine connecting to the source of energy and absorbing the energy until our vibrations are sufficiently raised. The main thing that this showed me was that I would need to shift from a sort of unknown implicit assumption about mediumship being more cerebral than anything else, to a way of seeing mediumship as being essentially embodied, so that physical experience is something that I would need to be careful to pay attention to in the interviews. Looking at the process of attunement, it was expected that we would develop a way of knowing when we're connected to the spirit world through a practice of inviting our spirit guides to approach and come close, or to back off, withdraw, so that we could sense the difference between the presence and the absence of spirit energy. This is something that from my participation in the circle seems to be easier for some people than others. For me, people's descriptions only relate to that week's experience. So in the interviews, I would really hope to be able to get insight, not just into the way they experience attunement, but also into their experience of change or progress over time. Similarly, with the use of focus and attention, these are seen as being used in the service of control. So if we want to make contact with, for example, a spirit known to someone in the group, we're told to focus our attention on doing this. Or if we feel uncomfortable or anxious, we can focus on a protective white light or ask for help from our spirit guides by focusing our intention on them. So focus and attention are in this way seen as having palpable effects on the communication processes. Again, in the interviews, I would hope to be able to explore people's felt experience of using focus and attention, to what extent they found these to be effective, and whether they perceived any change of the efficacy over time. Next slide, please, Chris. Okay, the development circle. The routine has a much shorter attunement process in which we try to make contact to someone who's known in the circle, to a discarnate who is known to someone in the circle. We take it in turns to describe our contact, and if anyone recognizes the description, we then have a conversation with this potential recipient and try to get further information from the discarnate, including any potential messages. Now, I'd asked to participate in the circle just for the sake of the experience. I don't see myself as a medium, and I didn't expect to be able to make any contact with any discarnates that would be recognized. I'd anticipated just describing someone from my imagination and the focus then going to the next participant. So I was very surprised when early on one of my descriptions was recognized. At this point, I also felt disconcerted, and I felt quite a sense of responsibility towards both the recipient and the discarnate to get the communication right. This was an experience that's been repeated on most occasions now. So I've had to take on board that, whereas I'd assumed that these sort of experiences happen to other people, there's the possibility that they are happening to me. And I have to acknowledge that actually I find this a bit disturbing is a bit strong word, but I have found it difficult to assimilate. So I still wouldn't describe myself as a medium, but this has given me a very useful insight into the way these experiences can challenge your worldview and your sense of identity. Overall, looking at both the circles, my general experiences have given me some further insights into general aspects of the phenomenology of mediumship development, including the wide variations in felt experiences, both in terms of the sensory modalities used and in the content, which shows me the importance of really not having any preconceptions about this when I'm interviewing, and just allowing people to describe their experiences as they have them. The second is the importance of the role of the suspension of disbelief, especially in the early stages. Many of the participants ask how they can differentiate between their imagination and genuine communication. And we were told that we should trust our imagination and just say what we see, something that obviously seemed to work in my case. This seems to be potentially a way of trying to bypass possible censorship of anomalous information reception. If we dismiss something as just our imagination. But it also relates to the next point, the process of learning to distinguish between, say, just what is imagination and what may be genuine communication, is not one that can be taught according to rules. It involves a process of implicit learning through feedback, in which, if a discarnate is recognized, the ensuing conversation with the recipient means that you can get feedback as to which of your perceptions may be correct, which are not. And the idea is that you, over time, you develop the ability to discern, to tell the difference between those that are correct and those that maybe not your imagination, but maybe a product, say, of your interpreting a feeling or a perception incorrectly. So in the interviews, I hope to be able to explore ways in which the interviewee's experience changes in terms of the clarity of their communications or perceptions. For my own part, and this relates to the illustration, I found it a bit strangely that while my descriptions of Descartes' say appearance, character and roles, etc. may be accurate, people often say that I'm wrong on the clothes. So they'll tell me that this sounds like this person and the overall description is accurate, but she wouldn't wear those sorts of clothes or those sorts of colours or shoes. And from my point of view, it's difficult for me to see a difference between what I see in terms of clothes and the other things that I see. So it seems I have something of a wardrobe problem to work on, and I don't know how long it will take me to develop the ability to see people's clothes accurately. So to sum up, the ethnographic experiences have given me very good and very useful insights into the common concepts and processes involved in the development of spiritualist mental mediumship, and to some aspects of the phenomenology of the processes, which will enable me hopefully to facilitate the interviews, to gain maximum insight into the people's experiences, something that will hopefully then go on to inform future research programs in this area. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass back to Chris at this point.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Ewan, for your contributions. Hopefully you have a flavour then of the research conducted to date and the findings that they have produced so far. And they give us a platform for the later phases of this funded project. Now is a point then for reflection. And so as we plan the next phase, we very much welcome your questions and comments. So I'd like to end the talk and open it up for questions.